welcome to the first of this year's Visual Studies Visiting Lectures. My name is Michael Leach. I'm Interim Director of Visual Studies while Kara Hatfield is on leave. The first thing I want to do is thank the Sachs Fund for Contemporary Art for making this event possible. We've been having a productive collaboration with the Sachs Fund over the last several years, and we're really appreciative of their support, and we really hope it will continue in the years to come. Visual Studies at Penn encompasses design in the broadest sense, but until tonight we hadn't brought to campus a specialist in design. We have people from all kinds of fields represented in the discipline, but we've been neglecting design, and so we're trying to make up for that oversight tonight by having not one but two designers and theorists of design to speak to you. David Reinfurt and Stuart Bailey, who constitute one design entity, Dexter Sinister. One never knows how to introduce a collective, how much attention to give to the individuals and how much to the group. So I'll give very little information. Actually, all I have is very little information about the individuals. David Reinfurt did his undergraduate work at University of North Carolina, and then graduate work at Yale, MFA work. Stuart did undergraduate work in the UK at Reading, and then graduate work in the Netherlands at Arnhem University. Dexter Sinister critically examines the fundamental premises of contemporary design and seeks to radically reimagine the place, form, and purpose of design in our time. Its design practice is in part, I think, a brand of institutional critique directed at the publishing industry. It challenges the organizational structure and the division of labor that's developed to supply our printed and digital publications. Subverting normal operations, Dexter Sinister sustains a small-scale vertical monopoly, integrating all the activities of designing, editing, publishing, and distributing books and journals, both printed and in digital form. As they describe their post-Fordist, non-bureaucratic, on-demand publishing ecology, it avoids waste. This is their words. It avoids waste by working on demand, utilizing local cheap machinery, considering alternate distribution strategies, and collapsing distinctions of editing, design, production, and distribution into one efficient activity. The original title of their collaboration, which began in 2006, was Just-in-Time Workshop and Occasional Bookstore. So you see that already, that collapse of functions was appearing. Their work has generated worldwide interest and wide distribution. They've been included in major museum exhibitions, including the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and numerous prestigious international venues. They've also turned their critical attention to art education. In 2006, they published an influential anthology, Notes for an Art School, comprising essays on the future of the art school by artists, curators, theorists, and educators, designed to, quote, rethink the goals and structure of an art school, its ideological contexts, and to interrogate the appropriateness and validity of existing school models. So that's enough from me, I think. Tomorrow at noon, Dexter Sinister will be conducting a seminar in the Jaffe Building, room 104, titled Welcome to Tomorrow Today. I hope you've seen the posters for it. It features the voice of the same asterisk who speaks on the poster for tonight's event, telling us that pictures are dead and interfaces will be replacing them. So I'm sure you want to be there to hear about that shocking development. And so that brings us to their topic for tonight, I'll be your interface. Please welcome Dexter Sinister.
Involved in for the last 15 years now. The first one of which was called ... was founded in 2000, and 20 issues were published over the next 10 years, so twice a year. And this was taken over, was continued by something called Bulletins of the Serving Library, so named because it's conceived of as being the house journal for another institution, sort of separate and sort of continuing the activities of Dexter Sinister that we won't talk about tonight, called the Serving Library. But lots of information about that online. And one thing that is consistent between these two journals, which are essentially the same thing with a slightly different publishing mechanism, that sort of foregrounded digital publishing when we changed the name in 2011, is that as well as channeling separate subjects in individual essays, which we call bulletins, they're free to download online. And those bulletins can be about anything from basketball to Germany to food to a wide range of subjects, including philosophy, cultural studies, mathematics. We're also interested in publishing itself as a subject. And so the ways in which these things are channeled, mediated, published online and in print itself constitutes a big part of what we're interested in. So probably through all the projects we're going to talk about tonight, you'll see that the way in which they're mediated, the way in which they're channeled, are a big part of the subject matter, if you like, or an equal part of the subject matter as the ostensible raw material, which might be to do with time, or in one case octopuses, or whatever. And finally, before I begin properly, I'll just put this image up, which I'm not exactly sure what I intend this to mean. It's just something that seems very elusive to me in terms of our practice. But I guess in some way simply refers to the fact that often one project swallows previous projects and becomes and undergoes a changing kind in doing so. And there's a kind of domino effect of how these projects kind of knock into each other and end up in places that we didn't expect. So first, I'm going to talk about a line of such projects, such dominoes, which began some 6-7 years ago in a collaboration with a Californian artist, photographer, and sculptor called Shannon Ebner. This is a piece of her work. It's a, I guess, fairly representative, fairly typical piece that combines photography and sculpture. It's an alphabet that's constructed from cinder blocks, placed on this grid of nails and photographed. And in many subsequent pieces of work, these letters, this alphabet, is reconfigured to write particular sentences and particular resonant texts. And around the time that we met her, which was in the context of beginning to collaborate on a book, which was eventually published by LACMA in Los Angeles, she was just in the process of making this work. And if I could sort of reduce Shannon's work to any kind of pithy description, it would probably be something to do with an interest, recurring interest in the seam between photography and language, and sometimes sculpture and language, or somewhere in the triangle of those 3 points. And so, for instance, there are certain allusions, poetic allusions from this piece of work, which are to do with the alternately concrete or abstract nature of language, the fact that the system of constructing the letters is a modular system, and the alphabet is itself a modular system. And one of the things that we started to discuss during the making of this book as a sort of kind of fundamental source material or references that we would be sharing with each other towards trying to work out how to articulate her photography in another medium, was something called the Visible Language Workshop, which was a small department set up by a graphic designer and educator called Muriel Cooper at MIT in the 60s and 70s. And of course, the Visible Language Workshop has a lot of resonance anyway for the sort of work that you've seen Shannon was doing. And at the time, David was engaged in a bunch of research towards producing eventually an exhibition and a book about her work, and was interested in her as an early model, an early instance of someone particularly from graphic design, we're both from graphic design ourselves, who was experimenting in an unusually free manner with both the sort of pedagogical format by setting up this very experimental department and kind of nascent technologies of the time, and was very productive for us to think about in terms of our work. And one of the things that he came across among many books and posters and early digital interfaces was this poster for an exhibition titled Asterisk, with a giant sort of hand-painted or hand-rolled asterisk. And the asterisk became, as you'll see from this line of projects, quite a sort of resonant image for us, I think partly just because of its simple reference to always pointing to somewhere else. Right? It's a connecting device, it's a piece of connecting punctuation to a footnote or to some later text in another form. And in talking about this with Shannon as well, it kind of inspired her to add a character, this time not made of cinder blocks but constructed from painted wood, to add her own asterisk to the alphabet. And somewhere along the way of making this book, the title became something that quoted from a poet called Francis Ponge. The title was The Sun as Error. The Sun as Error. And when we came to sort of do the final thing of the book, which was the cover, we ended up sort of appropriating the asterisk from Muriel Cooper's poster as a sun and an asterisk, so both an image and language at the same time, screen printed on the cover of this sort of large format hardback book. All this to introduce a line of thinking through this single character. After that book was completed, then Shannon was invited to do something at the Frieze Art Fair in London, and took the opportunity to invite us to do it together with her, basically to continue some of the ideas that we'd worked on in the book, but outside of the book format, so in a more sort of exhibition in situ, in a physical space in some way. So we sort of gladly agreed to try and do this and sort of extrapolate something from working on the book. But we had a sort of problem, all of us, in trying to conceive of something for what's basically an art fair with tens of thousands of people visiting over a weekend, in a context with very short attention spans and sort of, typically a need for a very immediate impact. Given that the sort of work all of us do tends to require a much slower and concentrated form of reception. So for a long time we were trying to think how to sort of deal with this circumstance, and eventually came up with the idea of trying to make something within the context of this very commercial, very popular, and very well attended art fair that would really be an excuse to channel it somewhere else to more conducive circumstances of reception. So to take the opportunity and budget and materials and the sort of audience, big audience, and sort of repurpose it or redirect that to somewhere else. And we were thinking through the term reading room, which I forget particularly where that came from, but would be a sort of obvious shared interest. But we started trying to think of a reading room not in the sense of a room where people come to read, essentially in private together, or really in a sort of lecture format where someone's reading a group of people, but a reading room which is a room to record someone reading and then to channel that recording to this other context. And to that end, we decided what would make sense would be to build a sort of recording studio, an impromptu recording studio within the art fair, and use that to record a text which would comprise an essay that we would then channel to another location. So we had a sort of structural idea, if you like, and that was more or less straightforward. And then we had to find some subject, some content, some appropriate raw material to be read and to be sort of turned into a text to be read. And there's a person we work with together who's the third member of the Serving Library project, who's called Angie Kiefer. And in the final issue of the journal ... she'd written a piece that ended up being titled Duck, Rabbit, etc., which was about many things that revolved around sort of truth and language and Wittgenstein. And there was one section of that essay that we excised from the final version simply because the essay was too long and this was a sort of tangent too far. And this little piece was basically about the idea of what it might mean to communicate without language, what it might mean for humans to communicate without language. And this little bit of text was premised on a video which is available to find very easily on YouTube. I think it was part of a TED talk, something like that, which refers to a particular kind of octopus, a particular cephalopod called the Octopus vulgaris, who has, among other qualities, the ability to change graphic form, to shift shape, to shift its shape to shapeshift immediately, and it's facilitated to do this by the fact that its nervous system is spread sort of evenly throughout its physical body. And this seemed both a kind of metaphor and example for this idea of what it might mean to communicate without language. I'm just going to show you quickly the original video that this comes from to show you the sort of graphic effect of this animal.
If you're an octopus or a cephalopod, you need to really understand how to use your surroundings to hide. In the next scene, you're going to see a nice coral bottom. And you see that an octopus would stand out very easily there if you couldn't use your camouflage, use your skin to change color and texture. Here's some algae in the foreground, and an octopus. Isn't that amazing? Now Roger spooked him, so as he took off, a cloud of ink lands, and when he lands, the octopus says, "Oh, I've been seeing, best thing to do is get as big as I can get." That big brown makes his eye spot very big. So he's bluffing. Let's do it backwards. I thought he was joking when he first showed it, so I thought it was all graphics. So here it is in reverse. Watch the skin color, watch the skin texture. Just an amazing animal. Can change color and texture to match the surroundings. Watch him blend right into this algae. 1, 2, 3. And now he's gone, and so am I. Thank you very much.
So, I guess the sort of fundamental implication of that in terms of what that might mean for humans is the idea that there's no process of translation between the idea and its representation, right? Its idea and its mediation. And that's the sort of thing that Angie was interested in picking up on, and the essay touches on things like information theory and etymology and eventually virtual reality, for instance. So this was an excuse to develop this one little fragment discarded from this essay into something that we would then channel through this situation at Freeze. And this is the sort of diagram of what became 8 chapters. And somewhere along the way, the idea became to title the essay An Octopus in Plan View, which we thought was also a description of an asterisk, and also, again, sort of something that points to another subject. So these are the sort of subtitles of the sort of component parts of this essay that ended up being called An Octopus in Plan View. This is the recording studio that we had built in one corner of the art fair. And what would happen was Angie would be sort of writing this text, planning this text probably in the 6, 7, 8 weeks before this happened. And we'd be finishing each chapter by the time the weekend of the art fair occurred. And we asked a friend of ours called Isla Levy-Yap, a curator from Scotland, to do?
Along the way in making this project, we also wrote about this project, or wrote about making the project, or what we wanted to describe the typeface. And we published this bulletin, which we wrote collaboratively together as Dexter Sinister. The title of this bulletin is A Note on the Type. I'll show you what this looks like. This was published in the first, actually it's published in the last issue of ... and then republished in the first issue of Bulletins of the Serving Library. In the meantime, in reformatting that publication, we decided to adopt this meta, the difference between the two font, as a kind of house style for Bulletins of the Serving Library. And so all the texts are typeset in this, including this one, which attempts to describe a note on the type. Attempts to describe meta, the difference between the two font, and some of what I've just relayed to you, and using the form of that typeface in order to convey its story. So that starts out like this. It starts out by defining the parameters. So the beginning of the text starts like this: weight equals 100, slant equals 0, superness equals 0.75, and curliness equals 0. And that is a set of instructions which define what these letters look like that you see there in meta, the difference between the two font, and goes on to recount some of the bits of what I just said. As we proceed through this text, which we've published in many different scenarios, but as we go through, then we also instruct the typeface to change itself in order to demonstrate, kind of like a type sample, demonstrate some of essentially what it can do, why it's specific. So here, the one parameter is changed, weight, and slant is set to 0.3, and superness, curliness is set to 20, and it looks like this, and it's the same typeface, same computer program that generated it, same meta font. But it looks quite different. And again, you see here it's changed once again. Slant is set negative, and it looks like this. And the excerpts that we're embedding within this are taken from other material that we were reading at the time. Yes. Here is yet another version of meta, the difference between the two font with changed parameters. One more thing I want to say about that. In setting up Bulletins of the Serving Library, we also paid careful attention not just to the kind of typesetting, but also imagining a kind of invented orthography for the journal. One aspect of which are these asterisks that we use here. We clearly did not invent asterisks like this. They come from writing emails and electronic conversations, but we found them pretty useful to mark out phrases. So here it says, on the book before I've written it. And we started to self-consciously use these kind of bracketed asterisks to mean something that's different than an italic, and it's different than all caps. Anyway, and it has suggests a different inflection. I'm not sure I can describe exactly what it is. I'm sure we've decided at some point in the past. Winking, okay, winking. Something like a wink, which is quite handy. But it's different than italics. Okay. This project branched out from paper and became, that text, a note on the type, became an exhibition, which we made at the invitation of Anthony Elms, who is now at the ICA here in Philadelphia, a curator. He was at the time in Chicago at Gallery 400, invited us to make an exhibition there. We decided for that invitation, what might make sense is to take those pages and essentially put them up on the wall and make a series of, make that text in a physical space. We called this exhibition The Plastic Arts, and it was all vinyl on the wall. This note on the type with different excerpts and kind of a different behavior, but that runs around a kind of small space and is interrupted by a couple of works which aren't quite vinyl on the wall. There's a painting by a British painter, Philomene Parecki. There are a couple of prints that we'd made, but essentially it looks like pages on the wall, and it's meant to be directly read in this case. The pixels are small enough to just look like blocks, but I assure you it's something to read. The next place where this project found itself was through an invitation to participate in another art fair, making a project for that art fair, Artissima, in Turin. This was in 2011 also. we were invited to make a project, a Dexter Sinister project for the art fair. What we came back to them and suggested was we would like to ask them to use our typeface to do all of the vinyl signage in the art fair. It's pretty big space, substantial signage which goes all over for this temporary event. They did. They took that typeface and they made all the signs using that type throughout the exhibition. We then, there was a project space we were handed as well, and so we then installed, again, something very similar to that note on the type. In this case, we called it a note on the signs, and it was intended to be a kind of walk-in caption for this applied vinyl that was this typeface which went throughout the rest of the exhibition. It again tells the story of that typeface. And uses different excerpts, in this case, series of things in Italian that related to what we're doing here. Next place I'll describe that typeface found itself is through an invitation by Art in America to make a cover for the magazine. They've been featuring artists on the cover, or featuring artists designing the covers for the course of that year. They've continued this process. We were invited to make a cover for an issue that stays around for a year, which happens to be the Guide to Museums and Galleries and Artists. And they print in a printed magazine format all the shows that are upcoming for the year, which seemed interestingly anachronistic to us for sure. But anyway, we responded back to them with designing this cover for the issue, but then also asked them to take our typeface and completely redo all the typography in this very dense issue of the magazine using our Meta the Difference Between the Two font, which they did. But this is what the cover looked like. I think I should speed up. The next place where this typeface existed was through an invitation from the Museum of Modern Art to participate in an exhibition called Ecstatic Alphabets. Ecstatic Alphabets, Heaps of Language. It was an exhibition that involved brought artists who were using typography in their work, and we were given a nice commission, which we responded to, which we suggested instead. What we wanted to do was use this invitation to help publish issue number 3 of our journal, Bulletins of the Serving Library, which we did. And this issue contained 13 texts that we had gathered around typography in a fairly broad sense. This is what the cover of that magazine looked like. But the bearing that this had on the Meta the Difference Between the Two typeface was it was an excuse also to develop that typeface into something an idea that we had in making the original static version of it. And that is, since it has a kind of infinite variety of forms, we thought, and all determined by parameters, we thought that it might be interesting to add a parameter to its arsenal. And that parameter would be time. So imagining a version of this typeface which not only changed rather fluidly on the page, but could be used on screens in a constantly morphing, changing form. So Meta the Difference Between the Two font you can imagine its parameters as constructing a 3-dimensional space, which you see here in the middle. So weight would be on the x-axis, so from Roman to bold, from thin to bold. Superness, which is the roundness of the O, could be on the y-axis. Slant, which is italic, back or forward, could go off in the z. And so those things together would describe a kind of 3-dimensional possibility space of how this typeface looked. We added we imagined a fourth dimension to this cube, which I can't show you here because it's 4 dimensions. But where the way that this dot moved around that space would change how the typeface looked, and it changes a parameter called pen, which happens to be the most substantial to what the letters look like. We made this program, this typeface, and we added a couple of characters out to the end of what we called it. We call this typeface Meta the Difference Between the Two font 4D, or MTDBT2F4D, which is there. String of letters. We use this first for the work that we put into this exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. The work, the bulletins, the issue that we make, is always a project of Angie, Stewart, and I all together equally. And it's an ongoing publication project. We try to have it run autonomously, but inevitably we also use exhibition invitations to help fund the publication of the magazine. In the exhibition, we use MTDB T2FRD to create an animation which played in the exhibition space, which we called a trailer for an exhibition catalog. Actually, I'm going to go back one step. That trailer ran for about on a 10-minute loop, and it included short synopses of the text that appeared in that catalog, and used the meta, the difference between the two font 4D typeface, in order to describe this. So I'm going to play you one of those descriptions from a text that appears in that issue by Graham Meyer called Let's Eat Grammar. Play that. In making meta the difference between the two font 4D, we also wrote a text which addressed that project in a wider kind of typographic history of attempts at rationalizing the alphabet over the course of 500 years. The title of that essay was Letter and Spirit, and that appeared in this third issue of Bulletins of the Serving Library. As I described, it reflects on design of letter forms and the tools and kind of pendulum swings towards definite rational systems for creating these things, which in the end behave better as letters when they're not overly rationalized. This essay, Letter and Spirit, we then condensed, edited, and used the software that we had made to use at the Museum of Modern Art to typeset this essay in its kind of native form, in the 4D typeface. I'm going to play you a little excerpt of that. It's a video called Letter and Spirit. This is the end of that video. that 4D typeface, we fielded an inquiry from the Caddis Contemporary Art Foundation, which is based in Paris and San Francisco, who expressed an interest in buying the original, the non-4D typeface for their art collection. And we suggested instead that we would like to use the constantly shifting one with them, but we had some stipulations. We suggested that what we would do is what they would do is to use this typeface as their logo. So rather than kind of putting it in the collection, they would apply it, use it as a piece of graphic design. But since it would be one that is constantly changing, then their graphic identity, which these places tend to worry about to no end, would be constantly shifting, kind of with fashion and with the times. We got them to sign a 10-year contract that said they would not change their identity for 10 years. And we set up a server that dishes out a new version of this typeface once a month, which updates on all their systems. And so that's been running for about 2.5 years at this point, or actually almost 3 years. And their identity has changed in the meantime. So here is what it looked like when it began. Here is what it looked like at some point. I don't know at which point. And you don't know where it's going to go because it's a computer program running with a set of random starting points. But what we thought was perhaps interesting is just the relationship of this changing form to the changing everything else that changes around it. And the impossibility of reconciling those things, I suppose. But I think it's most interesting when it gets committed to a physical form and marks a moment in time. So here it is painted on the outside of their space as a sign in San Francisco, which I thought was interesting. But that's, of course, the face at one particular moment.
Okay, part 3. And another project, jumping on another couple of years maybe. And another bulletin. This one originates in something that was essentially conceived and written by a friend of ours, a writer for the bulletins called James Langdon. He's a graphic designer and writer in Birmingham in England. And he proposed a text for the 7th issue, 8th issue, and it was based on this man, or this portrait of this man who's Gilbert Adair, A-D-A-I-R, who was a Scottish writer, and then never sort of have to get her to go into a recording studio or pay her again, and just have this kind of captured voice to do with what we would. She was game for that, and also paid her quite well. This is a sample, as you can see, of the sorts of sentences that Sarah Proc get the person typically to read in the studio in order to do that capture, which itself creates a very kind of strange kind of poetry. I'll just give you a quick sample of Isla reading some of the later lines in this. I think there's about 400 of these sentences that then, of course, cover the whole diphone set.
The team will tour Cornwall with the trophy. A year ago, I could barely walk.
So this is her speaking.
Our life has become a hell.
Speaking in a recording studio.
Mad Maxine at Cargo Ship Beach. The referee is Spanish and a top referee. Shut it down now. Turn it off. And
this is a portrait of Isla drawn in the same way as the Gilbert Adair one, which was sketched by a friend of James. And I'll give you a quick sample of what that then gets turned into in the sort of first version, the draft version of the voice that's constructed from the recording.
The source recordings I was built from were made by Lily at Carlton Studios in Glasgow, engineered by Jamie Telford. These recordings were processed, and my voice constructed by Sarah Proc in Edinburgh, using their proprietary software. The material in the source recordings was read from a script comprised of 619 short sentences provided by Sarah Proc. The function of this script was to collect sufficient examples of Ilalibriat's voice uttering all of the possible combinations of diphones in received pronunciation English.
So you can hear from that immediately that that it sounds like a sort of robot with a hangover or something with a speech impediment, and this was the sort of first unfiltered, unrefined version. And I just wanted to point to the fact that there's some parallel for us between how, when you see that version of Meta, the difference between the two font 4D moving, there's a certain sort of clunkiness, right? It's not exactly smooth, and you can sort of get a sense that there's an underlying script running it. And for similar reasons, we decided to keep a lot of the roughness of this voice, where sort of almost in order to give the idea that you're seeing an X-ray through the thing and seeing the sort of programming or the mechanisms that lie underneath.
Okay, this is the last bit. And it brings together several of the things that we've talked about. So Stuart just described producing this voice, this electronic voice of Isla, Lever, Yap. And before that, I described Meta, the difference between the two font, and Meta, the difference between the two font 4D. And prior to that, Stuart described the form of the asterisk and its wandering backstory. Well, these things all synthesize together in something that we've been working on recently, which is this, which has this name, Meta, the difference between the two font 4D asterisk, which looks like that, or is like that, MTDBT2F4D. I don't know how you say an asterisk. We decided that. A wink. I should wink. That's actually great. I'll do that. Okay. So this is the combination of these things. We simply had the idea further from synthesizing Isla's voice was that perhaps thinking of her and that thing as a house voice, and the Meta, the difference between the two font as a house typeface, that perhaps the two could meet each other and make some sort of soft piece of software, a kind of interface that we might use, a channel that we might communicate through and speak through, and use to convey text over the course of a series of projects that we've been doing this year. I'm going to show you, the next thing is a very rough combination of a voice that's not quite Isla's and a type that's not quite right, but gives you the idea.
I remember a television documentary that Channel 4 produced about Donald Judd after he died. I watched it in a video library in the basement of the monolithic concrete art block at Coventry University. Matthew Collins presented, looking very English, standing in the scorching Texan desert outside Judd's compound. A talking head contemporary of Judd's, Richard Serra, explained how Don began his career as an art critic and used his monitor reviews of painting exhibitions to foreshadow his own elementary sculptures. I can't actually recall, but I assume Collins delivered a comic parody of Judd's writing. Something like, there is a painting. It is red. There is another painting. It is green. A yellow band extends from its bottom left corner halfway along its bottom edge, and so on. What I took from Serra's commentary was the idea that Judd's bluntly styled prose was a kind of hoax, preempting his appearance as an artist, setting the scene for artworks best described by their technical specifications.
About at the same time, I came across this book, which was published in 1987. It's titled Design Interface. It's by Gianni Barbacetto, an Italian philosopher and newspaper writer. This book talks about, it just details a very concise graphic design project. In this case, it was the design of a series of panels of interfaces that would go on Olivetti photocopiers. Two industrial designer and a graphic designer worked together on this project, and then this book was published, which takes that minor direct design commission and kind of expands it out to talk about the history of all communication. It's kind of wonderfully expansive in general. Across from the introduction in this book is a picture of the Rosetta Stone. And it's offered up by the author boldly as a kind of proto-interface. So he's going to talk about these photocopier touchpads in the context of the Rosetta Stone. So it gives you an idea of where it's going. But he describes an interface in a way that was quite provocative to us. And he defines it. It's a big baggy word, interface. It gets used a lot in different disciplines. But he describes it as anything that lies between, that allows communication between two different realms of knowledge or existence. And so the Rosetta Stone for him is a kind of interface. The book describes this project, which is just a series of buttons and kind of graphic shorthands that allow a person to operate a photocopier machine, and the two incompatible systems to interface or to communicate one to the other. We liked this idea, and when we were beginning a series of projects over the course of this year, we decided to borrow its language just to think about the work that we were making for these. And we titled this series of 4 engagements we had, 3 of which were kind of art exhibitions, and 1 of which was an applied design project, using this language of interfaces. And in fact, the sentences which titled those 4 works run together to make a compound sentence. The first of those is the same as the title of this talk, I'll be your interface, asterisk, wink, something. This was an exhibition that was staged at the Bard Hessel Museum of Art upstate in New York. A small exhibition that was curated by Roxana Fabius in the Bard Curatorial Studies program, which included some of our work as Dexter Sinister and some other projects which she included, which she thought sat alongside of it. But it's just to say, the title of the exhibition was I'll Be Your Interface. When you walked in the show, you were greeted by this monitor on the floor, and a set of headphones. And on this monitor was an edited version of Barbachetto's introduction to his book on interface. I'm going to play you a little bit of that. And this is using the asterisk, the first version of the asterisk, which combines Isla's voice and Meta, the difference between the 2 font, to channel that text in a kind of audio-visual format. So.
I'll be your interface. Asterisk. There are magic words that emerge in the use of language and then succeed in imposing themselves on the mind. These are key/words, which seem to take the full risk of merging in a single term all the lines of force, complex intuitions, shifting concepts, and developing debates, incurring the danger that all of this wealth of notions, still volatile and unstable, be reduced to simple and closed verbal expression. That would be mortifying.
The second project was a project that we were working on for a small space in Athens. And the title of that project was Broadcasting from the Ether, asterisk. The name of the space is Radio at 10. It's a small exhibition space, it's a bookstore, they also do events in other spaces throughout Athens. We were asked to design a graphic identity for the space and to do a website for them. And we'd had an ongoing relationship with the director prior to this. And we suggested back to her that what we'd like to do is to use this asterisk as their kind of logo, and to also use that on the website as a speaking vehicle, so it would be just an audio-visual website, which would speak the programs that were happening through Radio at 10. Seemed like a good idea, as her project was also kind of intentionally diffused throughout the city of Athens and uses existing spaces as much as her own spaces. I'm going to play you a little excerpt of that speaking asterisk from her website, which looks like this.
Broadcasting from the ether, somewhere in and around the center of Athens, Greece, near the end of Petraki Street, this is Radio at 10. Radio at 10 is a bookstore. Radio at 10 is a showroom. Radio at 10 is an exhibition space. Each of these functions occur at different speeds.
The third project that we employed the asterisk on this year was an exhibition that we were invited to make in Bregenz in Austria at the Kunsthaus Bregenz. The name of that exhibition was At 1:1 Scale, asterisk. This is the space we're invited to do something in. It is the ground floor space of the Kunsthaus. It's called they call it the arena, this space. And it typically shows projects that aren't really contemporary art, more often are architecture, design, or publishing. So this is why we were invited to do something in this space. They had run a pretty active exhibition program over the previous 5 years, and it was coming up to the end of its run as the director was changing, curator was leaving, etc. So what we proposed to do for them, we kind of gave ourselves a brief for this art project. We said we would like to make something which would archive in the space all the exhibitions that had happened there previously, and we'd like to use our speaking asterisk to do that. We did that. We installed carpet in the space to make it a bit more comfortable for listening to a 20-minute long audio piece. It began by the curtains kind of automatically closing every 30 minutes, and then the asterisk appeared projected on the wall, as you see right here. And the asterisk proceeded, here's a closer view of it, and a kind of scaled version of it as we were figuring out how big it should be on the wall. But what the asterisk does is the voice begins by describing from the current exhibition, which is the one you're looking at right there, and describes what was in that space before at a kind of, we imagine it at a kind of 1-to-1 scale, imaginary travel back in time from that moment to 5 years ago. I'm going to play you the beginning of that asterisk.
Read now. I will be your interface. Asterisk. Please look and listen carefully to what I say. I was scripted by Dexter Sinister, the working name of Spuler Bailey and David Reinford. Dexter Sinister worked somewhere in the middle of his time, editing, publishing and distribution. And I am no exception. You're standing in the read now of the concise red ends. Look north. I am a moving glyph on the concrete wall. To the west is a window facing Lake Constance, which joins Austria, Switzerland, and Germany. To the east is another concrete wall. And over your shoulder, to the south, is the reception desk.
The voice continues on to start to describe herself, and then the first exhibition, and onwards, backwards. The final project that we use the asterisk in this year is an exhibition which is currently up right now in Munich. It's called On a Universal Serial Bus. This exhibition is at Kunstverein Munich, which is a space that has existed since 1823. It's a big, grand, old space in the middle of the city. What we did for the exhibition was considered its catalog first, and so we have been, over the past 5 years, we've been making a lot of electronic or software or video pieces, and we suggested for this exhibition to then produce a catalog of the exhibition, which would be released on a USB stick, on a tiny universal serial bus container. And on this container would be 4 projects and plus a file which uses the speaking asterisk, which we call README, which details the contents of the USB stick. In the exhibition, then all of the contents of the stick were staged out in the space, there happened to be 4 rooms, so we did each project in a different room, and the electronic pieces were supplemented by physical artifacts as well. This is the flip side of the Universal Serial Bus memory stick. This memory stick is published by Sternberg Press in Berlin. It's a follow-up to a previous publication of Dexter Sinister work called Portable Document Format, which was a small book they published. It's sold, it's just released, and it's sold as like a book, but it's a memory stick and won't be very useful in a number of years, so quick, buy one. Get them quick before your computer stops reading it. When you insert the memory stick into your computer, it looks like this, USB. And the contents of the stick are shown here as a series of 4 icons, which were projects, Dexter Sinister projects since 2006, which you see here. Identity, anyway, they're listed here. I won't go into those at all. This is the postcard that sits along with the stick that allows it to kind of be circulated as a book, i.e. it gets an ISBN number on the postcard. When you walk into the exhibition, you're greeted by this same asterisk who's fulfilling the function of what would normally be a wall text and reads to you about the exhibition. And I want to play just the end of that because we made this read, so this is also the README file. This is the same thing on the stick as it is in the exhibition, although in the exhibition it appears in English and in German, given the audience. But I'm going to play the English bit, and that's the last thing we'll show.
My file name is README. An MP4, or voice synthesized text, which lasts for 4 minutes and 22 seconds. I'm speaking the words you're listening to right now. In which case, let me also introduce myself. I was born back in 2011, in an essay by Andy Kiefer, that wonders what it might mean to communicate without language. My character is an asterisk, part of the extended family of a shape-shifting typeface by Dexter Sinister, based on a piece of software from 1979, called Metafont. And my voice comes from Scotland, sampled from the speech of Eiler Leaderia. Finally, this memory stick and its exhibition follow directly from 3 previous projects by Dexter Sinister in 2015, in New York, Athens, and Bregenz, all of which are hosted by my interface, and whose individual titles add up to a single looping sentence. I will be your interface, broadcasting from the ether, at 1-to-1 scale, on a universal serial bus. I will be your interface, broadcasting from the ether, at 1-to-1 scale, on a universal serial bus, etc., etc., etc.
That's it. Thank you for your patience. Okay, sure. Yeah, of course. Yes.
Hi. Thank you. The first thing that the thing that
And same thing for other like the double story and G, for example. Yeah.
So one of the things I loved in terms of the way that you set up the narrative is the possibility of a kind of post-language communication. And I guess in thinking about some of the outcomes, I perhaps was frustrated with the kind of convention in terms of their application. And I was wondering if there was a kind of post-organizational kind of way of having the outcomes be applied. And what I mean by that is in the way that the octopus kind of shape-shifted and found its own kind of relationship to these different contexts. Could the same set of possibilities be put towards, a brand or an organization? Like, why are those kind of a set of conventions in terms of? And I know maybe it is just because of the discipline of graphic design that it suggests that that's the only kind of possible set of outcomes. But the tool set that you've developed is so malleable. It would be interesting to see how it gets applied to things in a kind of post-organizational context.
I guess I don't, great, but I'm not sure I understand what post-organizational means.
Me neither,
here.
that's
okay.
Well,
but possibly what does it mean? Because I don't know how to answer it.
Well, I think, just the tool set being applied as a logo or as a form of identity for, a gallery or an arts organization.
Right.
But each one there's a kind of set of conventions. And
Okay, now I understand better. Well, I think, obviously it's an impossible goal that we've set up, like communicating without language. Like it's so slippery, I can't even attempt to address it other than by imagining the idea of shape-shifting of the kind of form doing as much of the communication as any kind of, but of course that uses conventions, right? I mean, all those things are so, we can't make some sort of a bridge between us without some shared material. And so whether it's formal conventions or linguistic conventions, so the project we're set out to do is impossible, right? Clearly that's the case. So I think in the application of this kind of strange beast that comes out of, this strange, or somewhat strange project that comes out of graphic design, I think for us sometimes these things resonate the best when they're then poured back into a very straightforward graphic design context, because then they play against type, or not exactly against type, kind of with type and against type at the same time. So it's clearly a logo, it looks like a logo, behaves like a logo, but it's something not quite that. And I think that's when it gets exciting to me, if that's not too vaguely stated. But Stuart, maybe you have a better answer. I think it's a good question.
No, not really. I mean, I'd only add that Angie's essay about that idea was absolutely speculative. She doesn't end with a particular answer. It's more like pointing to certain strands, like I mentioned, virtual reality or whatever, that have aspects of what that sentence implies. I'm trying to think immediately, like what's specific about the octopus example or that video. And I suppose it's the idea that the form that the octopus immediately changes into in order to scare off predator or the cameraman in that case is somehow inherently frightening, whatever that means, right? The form of it isn't a reference to a shared cultural understanding of the language, whether that's graphic or linguistic or whatever. It's somehow an imminent language in the way that you might be able to argue that red is imminently hot or dangerous, but equally other people would argue that that's not true and it's just culturally inherited. So I think it's more like that essay tries to just offer you a tool for thinking about those sorts of issues, and indeed how they might play out in practical circumstances to lesser degrees. And from what you just said, I also think hieroglyphics and logotypes, or a Nike symbol is also communication without language if you just mean linguistic language, but of course it refers to the cultural language of what we know that to mean. So and also I don't think there was, although narratively you might suggest like a bunch of these projects are sort of trying to address that communication without language. That wasn't really the case. It was just that was one stop along the way of a certain content that was used at a certain time. And then maybe just to go to what you were saying at the end about the Caddis logos, this applied thing for the Art Institute in San Francisco and Paris. I think partly what comes out of these projects for us are issues that don't necessarily have anything directly connected with, in that case, the typeface or the time or the movement, but just this idea of, in order for that project to work as we wanted it to, we sort of forced, almost blackmailed the institution into signing this contract. And we were just interested in that as an idea, because, as David said, institutions like that tend to worry to no end about identities, how they come across, their surface, their kind of mediation to the perceived public. And also tend to, partly because of that anxiety, change again and again and again, and hold on to something for 2 years, and a new director comes in and wants to overturn everything. We're constantly, as practicing designers, facing that sort of constant upheaval, and the fact that it's very difficult to get projects with any sort of longevity that can have the sorts of concentration or focus that a lot of the sorts of things we're interested in require. Or even, talking to an audience who sit with you for an hour and a half to sort of think through some of the implications of his work. And in a similar way, and in a quite fairly light-hearted way with this institution, we sort of said, this is the deal. It's like, if you sign this contract, then you have to keep using this moving typeface for 10 years. But the really nice bit about that was we launched the whole thing by having them sign it in front of an audience. It's like the institution signing in blood in front of a bunch of witnesses. Of course, it's not a very binding contract. Right? It's not very legal. It's something we also use to develop another iteration of one of the texts that we wrote. So just that as an issue, right? The 10-year contract, or what that means relative to contemporary design or designers, is a kind of offshoot trajectory. And a lot of these things sort of tend to do that. They're nominally about one thing, and they end up sending off ideas elsewhere.
One more question about the development of the 4D. How did you determine the interval of time that would be used? And just as like how you decided it seems to be static, like the time interval itself is not changing, it seems to be a consistent time interval. And if you had any, like, had you thought about somehow manipulating the time interval to be different?
Yeah, so I mean, really what you're describing is like how fast the ball moves through that three-dimensional space. Yeah, I mean, that was a kind of visual trade-off thing, and also making the idea more legible than less legible. It would be very interesting if, depending on what is being said, you could modulate how fast it's traveling through the things. How fast it's traveling through those, changing itself, basically. We kind of didn't get there, I would say. But also because it would compromise like how you make sense of it, I think. But that's probably why.
We've got some food and drink right outside the door, so we can carry on this conversation right on. Thank you guys very much.